Hello and welcome to another edition of another book review. This week I'll be reviewing The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. I'll talk very briefly about the author, go into an overview of the book, talk about what I liked about it, what I didn't like about it, who I'd recommend the book to, and finish off with what I'll be reading for next time. Michelle Alexander is a civil rights attorney. She was the former leader of I believe it was the Northern California ACLU. She is most famous for writing this book. The book that I reviewed is the 10th anniversary edition, so she has a foreword in the book talking about the book. I originally came out in 2010, and so this book was the foreword is the 10th anniversary. It was written about 5 years ago. So the original publication was about 15 years ago, and so there's been a lot of things that have obviously have changed in the country. For those maybe who aren't familiar, very influential book, was one of the top 100 books of the last 25 years by, I believe that was a New York Times list. What the book is about the rise, trying to trace the rise in mass incarceration. Michelle Alexander's theory is mass incarceration just being this idea since roughly the 1970s in the United States. The prison population as compared to the rest of the world has increased dramatically. Excuse me, I looked it up before, but the statistics are something like, if you include parole and probation and people who are incarcerated at the federal, state, local level, it's roughly 6.5 million Americans at any given time. Just to give you a sense, there's 220-ish million adults, so it's roughly 3% of the U.S. population, which is much, much higher than any other really non-authoritarian country. Michelle Alexander tries to trace what those roots are, why we have this system, and her solution is, or her belief is, that it predominantly comes from the war on drugs, first under the Nixon administration and then really under the Reagan administration, and everything that has come after that. Mostly the consensus between the Reagan, Bush, and Clinton White Houses. George W. Bush is surprisingly absent in the book. There's really not a lot about his presidency and how it related to drugs. She compares his spending on non incarceration solutions to drugs to Obama's kind of favorably, but other than that, he's really not in the book all that much. So she basically says the incarceration has risen due to drugs. The federal crackdown on drugs that really ramped up during the crack cocaine years of the 1980s and 1990s, followed by the Clinton administration expansion in the mid-90s of the 90s crime bill. And this has led to a disproportionate number of black and brown men really being locked up. And by black and brown men, she usually is referring to African American men. And that is what she believes is the rise of this system. And I thought the book was really, really well done in terms of laying out her argument. It flows very logically throughout the book. She writes in a pretty consistent manner. I think that the book is very thorough. I think it does a good job of showcasing her viewpoint, which is you have a series of this idea that the criminal justice system is colorblind, and how that in fact is not really fully true because of these inability for defendants to point to disproportionate sentencing, discrepancies in sentencing and policing in all these areas that have been backed up by the Supreme Court. And she lays out her argument very thoroughly. She has a section on why working class white people, who are oftentimes also harmed by the system, would not be fully on board of removing the system. She has a part on the black leaders of the civil rights movement as exist today, and how they have oftentimes not focused on mass incarceration, choosing instead to focus on things like economic gains and affirmative action and things of that nature. So the book is very, very thorough. One of the problems that I had with it is, and I think most people have with it is, I always find it very interesting to read something by someone whose political ideas are not mine, and her version of the world and her version of the solutions to me are pretty far to the left of the average American. She has, towards the end of the book, talks about really the need to have a guaranteed jobs program and guaranteed health care and guaranteed job opportunities in a way that really would guaranteed drug treatment, if so needed, would really increase the social spending quite a bit. And I think beyond what the average American would be willing to support by quite a large margin. At one point at the end of the book, she says marijuana should be legal as well as maybe other drugs. And I think that that's probably a good area to like kick off where I had some problems with the book. There's a lot of conflating with things. And she talks about many times in the book, she'll talk about outlier cases. Well, there was a case where someone was a nonviolent drug offender who was simply picked up and they were sentenced to life in prison. What she won't tell you is that that nonviolent drug offender was probably trafficking in large amounts of drugs, and that case, in terms of the roughly 6 million people that we're talking about in any given time, is a very small percentage of the overall population. She also talks about plea deals and understands plea deals, but doesn't really understand or doesn't draw the connection between the plea deal itself and how people will likely plea down to lower charges, which is the whole purpose of accepting a plea deal. So, for instance, if you were breaking and entering into a house and you're 19 years old and you steal a TV and they have you on video camera and they catch you and you have a couple joints on you, a DA could drop the breaking and entering charges against you and settle on just the joints. So, because there's not a lot of data due to privacy laws and because I don't think there's been a lot of desire to have all this data, quite frankly. And I think there are some points where she is correct about prosecutorial power and how a lot of this is not readily available to the average person. It's hard to know when someone has pled guilty to a marijuana charge as their highest charge. Is that really the only crime that they had committed, or were there other things? If you read this book, that person I described who pled down from breaking and entering and theft to just a marijuana charge doesn't exist. It just doesn't exist in this book. When she talks about the crack cocaine epidemic of the 80s, she has a long passage on that and how that scared a lot of people, and the media was very all over it. It became this lurid story, and then how that set the tone for the next 20 years. And that really led to the discrepancy between crack cocaine sentencing and powdered cocaine sentencing, which is something that she talks about all the time in the book, a lot throughout the book. She doesn't ever mention that homicide rates in some areas like nearly doubled. And certainly you could argue that it was a legislative solution to a problem that was maybe wrong, especially looking in hindsight. But they were trying to limit where buyer purchases, where buyer violence was occurring. So someone who's going to buy drugs from a gang, you have two rival gangs who may get into a shootout and people may get killed. And so, again, in hindsight, certainly you could argue that there was not a appropriate legislative response and maybe there's a better way of doing it. But a lot of the times in the book, you read it and go, well, you're comparing the current system to a perfect system that will never exist. Because the United States of America is probably never going to have a universal drug treatment program where we're spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on drug addicts on the federal dime. It may happen someday, but I don't see that happening anytime soon. But that was part of the problem too, is she'll sometimes say things like, well, Portugal has a different system than we have. And you're sitting there going, they very well may have a different system than we have. I don't know if anybody would say that that's the right system. And so property crimes, violent crimes related to drugs aren't really any kind of victims advocacy who also may look at this like this. The issue that I had in this book is Michelle Alexander has a very clear viewpoint, and I think she says, to her credit, at the beginning of the book, this is the book who I'm talking to. I'm talking to people who mostly view things the way that I view them. Now, what percentage of the American population who votes on these things and decides something complicated like what should drug crimes be? Are drugs 100% victimless? Do they have victims? If someone is killed as part of a drug buy, is that a completely unrelated homicide, or is that tied to the supply side system of purchasing drugs? Is crack cocaine, is methamphetamine, is fentanyl, are opioids, is ecstasy, is heroin, are they the same thing as marijuana? And in this book, she doesn't really do a particularly strong job, in my opinion, of dividing those things out. And then there are some times where she just feels like she just throws things at the wall to see if it sticks. So she has this section on DUIs that felt randomly and kind of tossed in there to basically say, if drug crimes were treated like DUIs, then you would lock people up for DUIs on the first time that someone had a DUI. And you're like, she's writing this in 2010, and so some of it is a retrospective. And I think a lot of times she was looking back at laws that were on the books in the 90s and the 2000s that I think to her were very, very harsh, that oftentimes befell people. I shouldn't say oftentimes, that, which is one of the other problems she has in the book, that sometimes may befell people who were just bad luck Brians, and you caught some bad luck, and you caught a bad judge, and you caught a DA who was in a bad mood, and they threw the book at you. Now, she doesn't do a particularly good job of looking through the history of DUIs to try to find that outlier case where someone got the book thrown on them for the DUI, because it's comparing an average to individual cases, which is something she does throughout the book. So there's a lot of that in the book. There's a lot of what feels to me to be written for a specific audience that already believes what she's trying to say. And the conversation, what frustrated me the most about the book, and I apologize for being really rambly, but what is cool about the book is that I think it's a really great book club book, because there are sections of it that you can take and have really long conversations on. She talks about Wren, which is a case in the United States in the 80s, where I think a Supreme Court case that they decided that if a police officer stops you at a traffic stop, as long as the stop is lawful, meaning there was a real reason for stopping you, like speeding or your registration was expired, they then have the ability to search on suspicions of drugs. And the Supreme Court at the time was, I think, more liberal than it is today. You had Ruth Bader Ginsburg on there. I believe Breyer was on the court. John Paul Stevens. I don't know who the fourth liberal member was. Souter, who is more of probably closer to a moderate than a liberal, true liberal. But it was a unanimous decision. It was a 7-0 decision. It was a 7-0 decision. It was a 9-0 decision. Trying to remember how many members are on the U.S. Supreme Court. It was kind of embarrassing. But it was a 9-0 decision that they decided that police officers should be allowed to do that. If you didn't think police officers should be allowed to do that, if you believe that vehicles were private property, though you're in public space, you then have to decide, well, if someone suspects human trafficking, are they allowed to search the car? If they suspect guns are in the car, are they allowed to search the car? So you just kind of go through all these permutations, and you kind of probably come to the conclusion, I think the court found that, like, to not allow police officers to do this would really be handcuffing them, pardon the pun, and limiting their ability to search for things. And so she draws that basically completely into the drug context. I think that's maybe more of a complex story than just drugs, but that was some of the frustration. Was I think there are a lot of times where I don't want to say she sees conspiracies when there are conspiracies, but there are not times where other reasons may be brought into an argument that are not tied to a racial argument. The other one was private prisons, and she doesn't actually talk about this as much as I thought she was going to talk about it. I always thought she was going to talk more about dirty cops, which is not something she brings up in the book. But she talks about private prisons, and she says, the white rural people benefit from private prisons because it brings jobs. It's like 700,000 jobs. So it's not really, in the United States, not really a huge job driver. But she says, it brings jobs. And so this is part of this again, I wouldn't want to call it a conspiracy, but this is part of this unspoken agreement. And you're sitting there going, well, is it possible just because in order to build a prison, rural land is going to cost less than it is if you're going to build in the suburbs where no one wants it, or in the inner city where it's going to be relatively expensive? Is it possible that that is one of the reasons that it doesn't really come into the calculation? So I'm trying to think if there are any final thoughts. There's a writer who she cites in the book who is James Foreman Jr., who wrote a 40-page response to the book, and he kind of brings a little bit more nuance to the things. She kind of talks real briefly in the book about black political power and the black middle class and how they view some of these crimes and how they tried in some ways to distance themselves. And in his article, he talks about how some of the harshness of some of these penalties comes from the black middle class, who are trying to really crack down on some of these behaviors. And so her argument, which she says in this book, that the people who are the least likely to be the victims of violent drug crimes were the people who were harshest on it. I think he throws a little bit of a wrinkle in that. So who would I recommend this to? If you're all interested in, and this is a book I could probably just go on and on about, because I thought It was a really interesting read. I think the topic is really, really important. I think the book does a little bit of a disservice by simplifying the story and making it really, I don't want to say 100%, but very basically viewing it through a completely racialized lens. And I think that there are other arguments that one would maybe bring in if they were maybe more closer to a centrist or to the right of Michelle Alexander and say, well, wait, what about these other things? One of the things that I would be remiss not to say it. One of the things, the underlying assumptions in the book is that white people and black people, because that's usually the two groups that she's comparing, use drugs at the same rate and they deal drugs at the same rate. And if you have some suspicion about self-reported studies that they rely too much on people who are upper middle class, more likely to be educated, more likely to be college students, and that really completely excludes people who are not likely to take self-reported studies, or you're concerned about people relying on self-reported studies, which there seems to be evidence where that happens, then a lot of her assumptions are questionable. And I don't think it's ever going to be something where it's going to really drastically change because the ratios are so skewed between arrests for blacks and arrests for whites when it comes to drugs. Or shouldn't say arrests, I should say convictions, which is another part of the book where there's a class component to all this. Towards the end of the book, she kind of calls for a class, people coming together, which is a little belied by the fact that she kind of calls, poor white people who are caught up in the drugs collateral damage, which probably doesn't make them feel great about it. But um, there's a class component to this as well that she touches on a little bit, but is not certainly the main thrust of the book. But I say all that to say it's a very, very interesting book. There's a lot there. There's a John Pfaff book called Locked Up or Locked In that I've heard recommended, as well as kind of a corollary to this, and I haven't gotten a chance to read it. I'll leave a link below to the James Foreman Jr. article because I think it's really, really good. If you've read The New Jim Crow, and let me know your thoughts. I know it's a very, very well appreciated book. I appreciate for what it's trying to do, and I think starting a conversation is really important in talking about this because there are a lot of resources that are given to this topic. And I think a question of drug legalization is a real question to have. I don't think this is the best. I personally was kind of put off by the way that the book went about doing it. I think it was very much had a victim mentality in the sense that everybody in the criminal justice system, she uses the words cages and labeled. So you're labeled a felon. You're not convicted felon. You're labeled a felon, which to me is like distancing the things from what you actually have done. And so there's this whole underlying assumption that, again, for every person who's in jail now, some white person somewhere also committed this crime. And that kind of, to me, kind of ignores kind of some of the property crimes and other crimes that come with drugs. And again, there's not really great data on that of how many people are in jail strictly for possession and how much of it is for other things. And so and she is smart enough to know that there is a distinction there, and she doesn't really want to wrestle with that. And some of that may be, again, lack of data, but to not even mention it all, I thought was a little bit much. And so if you read this book, you would basically come away with the conclusion that almost everybody in jail for drugs is in jail for possession of small amounts of drugs that they were using themselves. And most of those drugs were probably marijuana. And so I don't know if how true that is. There are other people who kind of claimed that that's maybe not so true. And from a prosecutorial standpoint, if you're trying to show that you were really tough on crime, I don't know if that's what you would want the public to know. I think you would want to show like people who got, like the person I described before, the breaking and entering person, you would want to show that that person got 20 years for breaking and entering or 15 years for breaking and entering, not like 2 years for marijuana. So there's a lot of assumptions in the book. Police have infinite resources and manpower to have a full surveillance state, and they choose to use this against this group of people solely because they can. So there's just a lot of stuff that you could infer from the book that I think is maybe kind of questionable. But despite all that, I think it's a great conversation starter. And I think if you are interested in mass incarceration, even despite some of the qualms I had with it, a lot of statistics in it are good in terms of like overall populations and what it's like for someone to come out of prison and how difficult that process is. And how there are all these, that's also one of the big points of the book is, your jail sentence doesn't end when you leave the prison. You have probation, parole, and all these other things where you are kind of followed through the rest of your life. She goes into the fact that a lot of prisoners, a lot of felons, convicted felons, lose their rights to vote. That's a very topic that I could go on all day on. If whether or not that's just, I think the value of that is going to differ greatly from person to person. I don't think it's very much like a one size fits all opinion of how detrimental that is. But I've gone on for too long. If you've enjoyed this, please feel free to like the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Please leave a link below or a comment below if you have read this. Let me know your thoughts. If you're very pro, if you're con. Again, apologize for being really rambly, but it's a lot of book and it goes in a lot of places. So until next time, bye.